Hi, everyone. My name is Martin Köring. I'm the head of the Economist Group's World Ocean Initiative. Welcome to the latest World Ocean Summit Insight Hour on the future of seafood. How can we feed the world? Today's webinar is part of a series that the World Ocean Initiative is putting together for our highly engaged audience of ocean stakeholders in business, government, and also civil society. Today's webinar is sponsored by Calista. There are opportunities to sponsor future webinars as well. You can get in touch with my colleague Tatiana. You can see the details on your screen to inquire about sponsorship opportunities. The next webinar will be on the need for investment in ocean protection and will take place on World Oceans Day on June the 8th. And this will be followed by a webinar on tackling marine plastic pollution on June the 10th. You can also see the details on your screen on our activities for World Oceans Day. These webinars will take place in the run-up to the World Ocean Summit and Expo 2021 in Lisbon, Portugal on March 2nd until 4th next year. I'm excited to put together the next World Ocean Summit. It will run for the 8th time, 2021. And also in focus from previous years. There will be a large-scale agenda. 250 speakers with a focus on accelerating the sustainable ocean economy. And also the audience size will increase to around 2,000 participants. So we're very excited, and hopefully we'll be able to put, for this event to take place in person again after these webinars obviously have given us an opportunity to continue the conversation virtually, but we are all very hopeful that the event next year will be taking place in person. We retain the focus on high-level conversations and policymaking at the event. There will be lots of plenary sessions that will be designed to seek solutions to accelerate appropriate action. Our agenda to deliver industry-focused tracks. We have 6 tracks at the event. There will be a focus on aquaculture and fishing, which will be the focus of today's webinar, of course. There will also be a focus on energy, plastics, shipping, and tourism. So we are introducing these industry-focused tracks at the event. And the new central feature will be a solution-focused expo as well. So we very much look forward to March next year. Also on your screen. So as yourself with the Q&A functions to our panelists. And there's also related events, and on your screen you will find, for example, the media player where you can see today's panelists, the Q&A. Please your questions throughout the session. These will then be put together for the discussion later on. There's a resource list as well, which includes a sign-up form for the World Ocean Initiative newsletter, more information about the initiative, and also relevant articles that we have recently written about the topic. You will also find our upcoming webinars and the main event in Lisbon on your screen. We're very excited that we have more than 800 registrations for this webinar, and we're very excited to talk about the future of so the structure of the today will we look at the more immediate challenge. We look at the impact of COVID-19 and the post-pandemic recovery as well for the seafood industry. And secondly, we will look at the broader challenge. So how can the world feed a growing population in a more sustainable way? So the immediate impact and then the broader challenge that we have to face beyond the pandemic as well. So I'd like to introduce to you our panelists for today. We have a AAA panel. And not only because the names all start with A. We have Anne Vistatar, the global head of seafood at DNB. We have Arnie Mathieson, the special advisor on oceans to the Deputy Director General for Climate and Natural Resources at the Food and Agriculture Organization. And previously also the Assistant Director General at FAO's Fisheries and Aquaculture Department. And we have, last but not least, Ellen Shaw, the President, Chief Executive, and co-founder at Calista. So today's topic is really crucial because food security is one of the biggest concerns around that we have in the world. I mean, population growth, close to 10 billion people by 2050, will lead to a protein gap that we really can't fill conventionally. So we have to look at expanding the seafood opportunities. Studies show that the ocean could provide over 6 times more food than it does today. So there is a lot of opportunity for the seafood industry and the opportunities there. However, global fisheries are under threat. We know that around 60% of the world's marine fish stocks are fully exploited and 33% overexploited. So there is an issue as well with illegal fishing, for example, and subsidies that are harmful and so on. So really, there are lots of opportunities to tackle those issues. And then, of course, we have the aquaculture industry that could provide 2/3 of seafood for human consumption by 2030. The aquaculture industry is also facing challenges. For example, the reliance on wild-caught fish for feed is under intense scrutiny. So that's why we're very excited to have this panel today to discuss the various aspects of the future of seafood. So we'd like to start firstly on the impact of COVID-19 and the post-pandemic recovery for the seafood industry. So I'd like to start on the impact of COVID-19. And I would like to start with Arni and ask you, how is the pandemic affecting our challenge to feed the world? And where do you see the biggest impact? Arni?
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for the invitation to be with such an interesting panel for such an interesting discussion. I think you could say that the impacts are primarily three or four categories. And the first is the consumer side, where you have seen consumer preferences change, or you could also say consumer possibilities to consume change because of the various restrictive measures. And you have then seen on the production side the possibilities for the producers to produce the products. For instance, because of labor issues, they have not been able to get the laborers to the factories as in the past. And then thirdly, there have been logistic issues and in and around the transport. This has varied from country to country, but definitely not all of the producers have had the same possibilities to distribute their products. And then under some conditions, you have had price changes because of these restrictions or in some cases oversupply. I would say in general that the industry and the transport industry has been able to react quite well, and some of the producers have been able to respond to the changes and fill in gaps that have been created because of supply or because of demand that has been increasing. So it has shown the versatility that the industry with the highest rated commodity in the world has. But definitely, overall, there has been lowering, so there's lower incomes both for companies and individuals involved in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Arni, for highlighting some of the immediate challenges that the industry faces as a result of COVID-19. I'd like to go to Ellen now to ask you, how does COVID-19 shape the aquaculture industry, and where do you see the biggest challenges and maybe perhaps even opportunities as a result of the pandemic?
Great, Martin. Well, the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report for 2020 was highlighting water shortage, overexploitation, man-made environmental disasters, and climate change as serious risks pre-pandemic. Now we have a pandemic on top. So I can't emphasize the seriousness of the situation. But in terms of aquaculture, I think one of my biggest concerns is it's an industry that operates to what is known as just-in-time with regard to supply chain. Margins are tight in this industry. People don't carry a lot of inventory. And any disruption at any point in that chain could have catastrophic effects. on the food supply chain. And I think that's particularly acute in the modern world where we have a heavily integrated global supply system. That's one of the reasons why the Chinese government and our partner, Adesio, one of the world's leading nutrition companies, are so keen to get our first production plant up and running in China, a country that has tremendous interest in food security. It's also the world's largest aquaculture market. And what the world needs now, and one of the vision that we have for our company and other companies, is to try and get completely non-conventional sources of protein into the market as quickly as possible. The land and water overexploitation is really taking things to breaking point, and the global fisheries are at breaking point. We need completely novel, almost non-animal, non-vegetable sources of protein to plug the protein gap that you referred to earlier. And that protein gap is huge. It's absolutely huge, like 30 million tons. Our first plants in China will be 20,000 metric tons a year. That's nothing compared to what is required. But we're encouraging other companies. We'll come on to some of the issues that we face, investment being one of the most important, I think. But we must encourage companies to step up. And we have to be very careful about supply chain, increased nationalism, protectionism. These are all leading us, taking us in the wrong direction. And we've got to make sure that we can bolster this global supply chain. And I think that can really, a big part of that is introducing completely novel sources of protein. And we can talk about that later.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alan, for highlighting some of the challenges in the aquaculture industry. In particular, you mentioned the just-in-time model and the supply chain risks there, and the need to look at non-conventional sources. So now I'd like to turn to Anne for a bit of an overview more on the financial investment side. So how does COVID-19 affect the trends in seafood investment that you saw before the pandemic, and what are the biggest challenges for you? I think you're on mute, Anne.
Sorry. Okay. First of all, I very much agree with what Arnie and Alan had their statements. I think when it comes to investments, it looks like seafood and food in general is kind of a resilient area. So we have actually raised both debt and equity several times the last months, and it seems like there is investors, they are interested in this sector, and perhaps also, with the pandemic, perhaps a reminder that the world is a vulnerable place to be, and food security is important. And of course, we have seen all the hiccups in the transportation. We see some changes in the market. We see home shoring. For instance, we have raised money for two land-based enterprises, and then that is, a less vulnerable investments than some others. And we see also a lot of changes in the market. E-commerce, more use of frozen food, perhaps less waste. So there is a lot of trends there going on, and which are strengthened after COVID-19.
Okay, great. Thanks for highlighting some of the trends you saw, and that they are actually strengthening, and that there are some developments that that have been reinforced by the pandemic. So I'd like to ask the audience now to give us a bit of a flavor on how they think the seafood industry will operate in the post-pandemic world. So we have a poll question here. How do you expect the seafood industry to operate post-pandemic? And you can click on there to look at the the different scenarios, whether you think that the post-pandemic world will be mostly kind of business as usual. There will be less focus on sustainability, or whether there will be more focus on sustainability. So please click on your answers. And I'd also like to remind you that you can send your questions to us in the Q&A function, and we will be able to answer those later on in the Q&A section. So let's see, I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer the poll question. Can we have the results, please, on the screen so that we can see the results there? Can you push the results live, please? Okay, so we can see that we have 73% or so actually say that there is more focus on sustainability. So that's really interesting, and that's a sign of optimism that people actually think that the post-pandemic seafood industry will focus more on sustainability. So to the points that were made earlier by the three speakers as well, that some of the trend pointed towards sustainability already. So, and what do you think about that? I mean, it seems that the audience is optimistic about more sustainability. And what do you think? Will the seafood industry return to business as usual when pandemic-related restrictions ease, or will there be this bigger focus on sustainability?
I think that this drive for sustainability just will continue. And I really understand, and I agree with the poll. This will just strengthen the development that we are seeing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, brilliant. Alan, what do you think? I mean, this seems the audience seems to be optimistic that there will be more focus on sustainability. Think about that. Are you as optimistic? And what do you think? Would there be business as usual or more sustainability?
Oh, we're very optimistic, and I agree with Anne. I think that poll is spot on, and in these dark times, actually quite reassuring, to be honest with you. So I thank the audience for their optimism. Sustainability, it's absolutely core to what we're doing. I mentioned China earlier, but we're seeing an amazing trend there. They're moving away from low-value fish like carp to higher value, more nutritious whitefin fish. Though there's increasing demand from the consumer for sustainable feed, which is a critical part of aquaculture. In fact, I think it's one of the major bottlenecks for aquaculture's growth. People genuinely care about what they eat. The two primary conventional sources of protein in the world, land-based animals and plant-based, it's just not sustainable. And we're finding that our customers, because we're a B2B company, our customers, the feed manufacturers and the aquaculture producers, are almost demanding it. Thai Union is a great example, a very good partner of ours. They want to eliminate food fraud. They want to improve working conditions. They want products, a shrimp that is fully traceable. They want increased transparency, traceability literally from the pond to the plate. And I think this is tremendous. I mean, the consumers expect it. I think we as B2B, people in the supply chain, should demand it. And, we can't just keep taking from the planet. We've got to start giving something back.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Alan, for highlighting, that those trends towards sustainability and the, not just environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability, working conditions, traceability, and these kind of things. Ani, what do you think about the poll result? Do you think will the seafood industry return to business as usual when pandemic-related restrictions ease, or do you think there will be this drive towards more sustainability?
Well, I hope there will be a drive to a more blue or green world, but I don't think that the poll reflects the proportions. I think there will be more of a balance between a push to business as usual and to more sustainability. It'll still be a struggle for us to improve the situation, whether it's from a purely environmental perspective or from the socio-economic perspective. I think we are in general just still too enamored by our lifestyle, and that there are just still too many people who are making too much money out of doing unsustainable things. But I still think, or I hope, that things will improve and it will be easier to push the blue-green agenda.
I think it's reasonable. It seems that the audience agrees, and you're already sending lots of interesting questions. So please keep sending questions for the Q&A later. So I'd like to move to the next section of the conversation, which is the broader question: how the world feed a growing population in a more sustainable way. So beyond the pandemic, already we talked a little bit about some of the trends that we have seen and how they have affected the seafood industry. And now I'd like to turn more to those kind of more specific trends that we have seen in the sector. So for Arni, I'd like to look at fisheries kind of more broadly. I mean, there were lots of trends that we have that started before the pandemic and that are here to stay. So, for example, overfishing, IUU fishing, and subsidies in the sector. How do you see progress on those kind of issues kind of resume and accelerate in the next couple of months?
Yes, you're absolutely right. We will still have all the problems, and some of them may even be worse for the effects of the pandemic. We still don't know how it will play out. But dealing with them is of a variable level of difficulty. The subsidies is the easy one. That's just a decision. It is a political decision that people need to take. The IUU is more difficult, but the part there that is most difficult is the I part, the illegal part. And we have done a lot of things in recent years. The Port State Measures Agreement is obviously the highlight, the global record, and the flag state implementation guidelines, and a lot of capacity building that is going on at the moment. The next step that we need there is a series of regional agreements where flag states and port states come together in sharing information and taking action when the information leads you to suspect illegal activities. But we will still be in a world where you have what we are starting to call now the two divides. The great divide that obviously everybody knows, but there's also a fisheries divide that they over the past 25 years, there has been a very positive change in the Northern Hemisphere, and stocks there are in a better situation than they were before. But in the South, the situation has correspondingly gone worse, even though on the whole, it seems to be in a balance. So it is this divide that we need to tackle. And as we mentioned earlier, fish is the most traded commodity, and it is moving to a large extent from the south to the north. And we need to get more resources into improved management. And there the conservation issue obviously comes into it. And management is really the best conservation. That's the direction we have to go.
Thanks, Arni, for highlighting some of the kind of solutions to these kind of long-standing issues. You highlighted the management focus and the need to address this divide between the northern and southern hemispheres, and to focus on where most of the fish is actually coming from. I'd like to ask Alan now, in terms of the challenges that we face in aquaculture. What are the main challenges that you see for the sustainable aquaculture, and how can these challenges be overcome?
Well, Martin, you mentioned earlier that aquaculture has the potential to provide 6x the volume, and that would be approximately 2/3 of the seafood that people eat. The volume, the scale of that statement is huge. And one of the biggest bottlenecks in the aquaculture industry is access to feed. It's not necessarily that people don't want to invest in aquaculture, although that is, in my opinion, the second bottleneck, and I'll leave it for Anne to comment on that. But you need access to feed. It is totally unsustainable to farm fish from the ocean and feed it to fish that we farm for ourselves. Completely unsustainable. Now, aquaculture is one of the most efficient forms of protein farming in the world. That is why we will get to these numbers, and the trends are moving in the right direction. But access to novel alternate sources of feed, and when I say feed, we're primarily talking protein here. The majority of fish that people eat in the world are carnivorous. That is, for me, the biggest bottleneck. And let me put this into perspective. So salmon farming today, but of course we've got shrimp farming, which is another significant element of aquaculture. We feed them either fish meal or soy, predominantly. And our lead product, FeedKind, and we'll have that on the market in 2022, I mentioned earlier, but 100,000 ton a year production plant of FeedKind will fit on 10 football fields. And I think most of the audience listening in today can imagine what 10 football fields looks like. That produces 100,000 tons of completely novel, non-animal, non-vegetable protein that takes nothing out of the human food chain. The equivalent amount of protein, if it was soy, would require arable land the size of Chicago. Now, that has to be a big part of our future. And we would hope that within 10 years, you would see 10 such plants around the world, and that would still only be producing 1 million tons of novel protein, and the target is tens of millions in aquaculture alone, and the investment there is billions of dollars. So in summary, we absolutely must find alternate sources of protein. We've got to stop taking fish. Well, there is no more. We've got finite resources in the ocean, finite land, finite water. We've got to have a new solution, and it's a big problem, and it requires a big solution.
Thanks, Alan, for highlighting the bottlenecks in aquaculture, highlighting the access to feed and also the access to investment as a second bottleneck, and that is an important element. And I'd like to ask Anne now about this second bottleneck, namely investment, and more broadly also investment in the seafood industry. How does the investment community assess the outlook for sustainable seafood?
Yeah. I would like to highlight that, aquaculture, I think that is more of a solution than the problem. And of course, there are problems in aquaculture because there is a long value chain. And Arne, you touched upon, the big problems there being illegal fisheries and modern slavery, or like Alan, make use of scarce resources to feed fish with fish, which could have been used for human consumptions. These things need to be addressed, and I think that the consumers, we are concerned about what we eat and what we eats. You would like to eat a fish who have had a good life and healthy diet. And it's also a problem with this industry that it is fragmented. There are very few, if you take the total picture, there are few really big industrial players. You will find that within the salmon industry, that there you have, this is an industrialized niche where it is easy to find financing. I mean, good projects, they get finance. these markets function. And again, what's also good is that they could attract what you call green financing. So it is attractive both for lenders, the big company, but also for the investors. Like a bank like ourselves, of course, we are lenders, but we also have a huge number of assets under management, so that you can influence the industry also for investments. And again, financial markets, they are open here. And we see that there are so many investors out there with what you call ESG mandates, and they would like to put their money into this industry. I don't know if that answered your questions, or if you have a follow-up, Martin.
Yes, it does, and it highlights as well that there is this potential, but it is a fragmented industry, and there is this opportunity to influence the industry through the assets under management that you mentioned. So there is definitely the opportunity, particularly with the rise of ESG that you mentioned. We do have to move on to the next topic, though, and I'd like to involve the audience as well. Again, as you know, you can send your questions, and I can already see a lot of very interesting questions coming in. But first of all, I'd like to ask you another question, another polling question. So can we have the second poll question now, please? And this one is about what will be the key factor in creating a more sustainable seafood industry. So here we're asking about what you see as the biggest kind of trend that drives the sustainable seafood in the future. And we give you the option to select customer preference, policy governance, technology developments, and increased investment. So please pick your number one choice in terms of what you see as the key factor in creating a sustainable seafood industry. So yes, it would be great if you could answer that question. We have a lot of answers already. I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer that question. What do you see as the key factor in creating a more sustainable seafood industry? Okay, interesting. Let's push that. Let's push that live, please. The biggest trend is here that policy governance. So that would be the key factor. That's really interesting. And then we have as a secondary one, customer preference, and then technology, and then increased investment. So although we did just talk about investment, it's actually policy governance that is seen as the key factor in creating a more sustainable seafood industry. So what do you think, Arni? Is that something you expected? What do you see as the role for policy and governance here?
Now, I'm a little bit surprised, but in a way, pleasantly surprised that people see that policy and governance is so important, because it really is. But I would look at this from a slightly different perspective and look at what I would see as sort of the first limiting factor, and that is sort of technology development. If we don't get technology development, then we will not really get anywhere with our policies, and the customers will not have a preference, and the investors will not have anything new to invest in. So I see that as the first limiting factor, and in a way, all of these four factors are necessary. So I would possibly put technology development as sort of first amongst equals, but still, given my background, I'm pleased to see how much importance people put on policy and governance.
Brilliant. Yes, yeah, it's really interesting. Alan, what do you read into those results? Do you agree that it's a sustainable seafood industry isn't really possible without a supportive policy governance? And do you see anything else in that poll that surprises you or that you agree with?
Well, yes, I'm I'm similarly surprised, and I really do reflect Arnie's reaction. And yet, probably 25% each might have been what I would have said. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of technology. I believe Arnie's spot on there. Our product is 25 years into development. It was first developed by Statoil in Norway. Novel proteins don't just fall off trees. That's the whole point. They don't. There is significant development and investment required. I mean, Callista is an innovative company, first and foremost. We understand what's necessary, and everything has to be done safely. You have to do extensive animal testing. All of this takes many, many years. I mean, that I think the link with governance and policy could play a role there. I mean, if we're bringing on novel sources of feed, novel sources of food, it's a bit like what's happening with the vaccines today with the pandemic. Governments are encouraging the regulatory authorities like the FDA to accelerate and expedite testing. I think that would be appropriate to accelerate investment and deployment of aquaculture, but it cannot be done at any risk to people and to the safety of animals. Absolutely not. But I could see a connection there. But I'm surprised at the low percentage on investment because at the end of the day, nothing is free. And significant investment has to be made across the entire supply chain for someone to be able to eat a salmon or a shrimp that was grown on a fish meal-free diet. But yes, very interesting response.
Great, thanks a lot, Alan. Yes, I'll take that directly to Anne. I mean, given that you have highlighted how important it is that investment in seafood is accelerating, that there is the appropriate financing for the transition to sustainability in the sector. What do you think? I mean, obviously you have an interest in the investment area. Are you surprised by the result? And what do you see as the key drivers? I mean, in a way, Arnie mentioned that these four factors all play a role. And how do you see this result?
Of course, they are all important, but I mean, my bet would have been the consumer behavior, because I think, that the consumer demand to retailers is so strong, and it will kind of pull through the entire value chain. And then it is technology, because there is so much going on here. It could be different feed ingredients, as Alan is talking about. It could be offshore farming. It could be land-based farming. It could be genetics, use of big data. There is, I mean, this is the aquaculture industry is still a young industry, so there is so much going on. But I mean, everything is important here, and of course, investments need to be financed.
Exactly. In a way, they all feed into each other. These factors, as you mentioned, consumer demand drives technology development, and then policy as well influences that development. So that's definitely right. And then investment is required to make it happen. So, but it's a really interesting result. I see we are now almost in the last third of the webinar. So we'd like to move to the question and answer session. I've seen a lot of questions already coming in. Please continue to send them. We will collect them, even if we don't have a chance to answer all of them. There is one interesting one that kind of follows on from what we just talked about with policy and governance, and that is, do you see increased regulation on aquaculture as an important part of ensuring it meets the food security gap in a sustainable way? Maybe Alan, that could be one for you.
Well,
do you see increased regulation?
In a positive way. I mean, Arnie mentioned earlier, illegal fishing. We need increased transparency. Governments can help. There's a lot of very willing people out there with good hearts who genuinely care and share our vision for a cleaner, safer world. And I think we need all the assistance we can get. So I think positive intervention. I'm not a fan of subsidies in terms of supply chain. That's largely because I'm an industrialist, and I don't believe that it's good business sense to attempt to build a new industry on subsidies, because subsidies can be given and they can be taken away. One of the things that we focused on at Callista is to ensure that feed kind can be produced economically without any subsidy whatsoever. We're not reliant on government handouts or any form of financial assistance in that regard, because it's so important that the products we're producing are sustainable, but it's also important that we are sustainable as a company, and being economically viable is critical. So I'm not a big fan of subsidies in that sense, because I think this industry needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. But absolutely, in getting us across the finishing line, we could all do with a nice nudge.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alan. There's another question actually on subsidies that might be interesting for Arnie. You mentioned fishing subsidies are harming the ocean ecosystem. How would you see? What would be a suitable alternative to subsidies to help the marginalized communities?
Well, yes, I was just unmuting myself. I think what the marginalized communities need are in investments in enterprises that are then operating according to rules and regulations in line with our major principles of socioeconomics and the environment. I don't think you will be viable in the long term on subsidies, and you need to have investments, and you need to have the private sector involved in it, because you need to have somebody who cares and thinks about the future of the enterprises. Because if the enterprises fold when the donors leave and the project is finished and there's no more grant money coming, then there's all for nothing. It needs to be something that somebody has ownership of and will care for because of his own personal interest and the interest of his community. I think that is the alternative to subsidies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And you mentioned investment as well, and there have been many points here on investment. So what would you ask food sector more investable?
Was this for Anne, or?
Could you please repeat if it was for
As
me?
As an investor, what would you ask policymakers to do to make the seafood sector more investable?
I mean, first of all, to comply with all rules and regulation, but that is just a license. You just have to do that. I suppose in the part of the world where we are active, we actually think that rules and regulation is a positive thing, because, for instance, within aquaculture, it takes down biological risk. So having the right regulations, that is a very favorable thing. I'm not so much into the part of the industry where you make use of subsidies. Okay,
well then on to the next question on on misinformation in aquaculture industry. So there's a question on misinformation is still rampant in the aquaculture industry and oftentimes shut down investment projects. How can the industry combat negative publicity and highlight the important role it plays in food security and economic development? Alan, what do you think?
Oh, well, I think we've got to move to full transparency. Some of the industry's leading companies are already doing that. Yes, there's a lot of talk, and we need a lot more walk. But I mentioned Thai Union earlier. They're a world leader in moving and really stepping up in terms of fully traceable, eliminating food fraud, as I said earlier, improving working conditions. And their stated goal is to move to a completely fish meal-free diet for their shrimp. So there are significant initiatives and investment already underway. But I think transparency, clearly economic benefit, if we can improve the livelihood of everybody in the supply chain, it's easier for people to comply. I go through life believing that everybody I meet is honest and that they want to do the right thing. And sometimes situations that are out of their control can make people possibly not be that way. I think as an industry, as leaders of this industry, if we can improve the overall well-being of everybody in the chain, introducing a modern industry, modern work practices, deploy world-class technology, significant investment. I think across the board, it will be easier for full transparency. And one of the key attributes of our product is it's completely traceable. It's amazing that we can do this, but a shrimp that's fed a feed that has a feed kind in it in Thailand, you could literally take that shrimp off a plate in a restaurant in London, and with a very simple test, you could confirm that shrimp ate a feed that contained feed kind. And that's going to be transformative for the aquaculture industry, technologies like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. There are lots of questions here about technologies as well. There's one on what are some of the most critical technologies needed in aquaculture besides feed? I mean, Alan, you had mentioned feed. Maybe Arnie, you mentioned the importance of technology earlier. What are the most critical technologies needed in aquaculture besides feed? There is a related question here about the importance of seaweed, for example. What do you see as the critical technologies? Arnie?
In relation to seaweed, it's probably the harvesting technologies and how to design them. But with regards to almost all of the marine organisms that are potential for farming, it's the genetics as well. Genetic improvement is needed to increase their productivity. And if we compare aquaculture, almost sort of any living organism in aquaculture to living organisms in traditional agriculture, then traditional agriculture has a 10,000-year lead on aquaculture, 10,000 years of animal improvement and genetic improvement. And so I believe that in general, the genetics are going to be something that opens up new fields for us in the future.
Mm-hmm. There's a related question here on can the panelists address the role that plant-based, cell-based seafood may play in increasing the resilience of the industry in the face of major challenges like a global pandemic? What do you think? Is that a prospect?
I think so. I think the plankton, both phytoplankton, zooplankton, and even marine bacteria have a great potential as feed and possibly as as a source for food in themselves, and we should be looking for that. This is primary production, and this is using the surface area of the oceans to the best effect. We are only using 1/3 of the surface area now in general to capture the solar energy to produce most of our food from terrestrial animals, and we still have 2/3 or the capacity of the oceans to tap more or less. We have our food coming from the oceans inside 5% of the total when we look at protein, and lower when you look at the calorie intake. So there is a lot of capacity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have a view on the technologies needed in the seafood sector and aquaculture and beyond?
Yeah, because I mean the big cost in aquaculture, that is of course the one is biology and the other one is feed. So whatever you can do to reduce biology risk, for instance, genetics, improved feed, so that the fish stays healthy, or to make use of other input or feed ingredients that has a smaller or as small as possible footprint on the earth. These two things are important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. There is an interesting question here as well about investment and where this investment should come from. But I'll go to Ellen on that one first, because we had discussed earlier the need for investment. Where do you think the investments into seafood should come from? Governments, industry, or elsewhere?
It's a great question. We talked about the importance of technology earlier, and I think that's an absolute given. So technology, innovative companies like Calista, we tend to be private companies. We have to raise capital essentially by issuance of equity, particularly in the early stages. I'm a bit of a serial entrepreneur, to be honest. This is my 4th company, so I know how to build companies, and I've done it. As I said many times, you have to start with equity, but equity is expensive. And of course, once you start to get yourself to the point where you have a product or a technology that's ready to be deployed, and this again could be like 10 years into development if you're lucky. You then either have to build a manufacturing plant or you license your technology out. But even if you license it, someone still has to build the plant or the system to deploy the technology. And at that point, you cannot continue to do it by issuance of equity. It's just too expensive, and your original shareholders just don't get a return. I mean, this is just the practical world that we live in. So you've got to look then to the debt markets. You've got to look then to people like Anne, green bonds, banks. So we've been blessed at Calista with very early stage investment from a leading venture fund that's focused entirely on aquaculture, based in Holland, called Aquaspark. I think their model is amazing, and we're all so lucky to have them. I mean, aquaculture generally is lucky to have them, not just Calista, but they're targeted just on aquaculture investment. We need more people like Aquaspark. Recently, we had significant investment from Adesio, a world-leading, significant world-leading animal nutrition company, headquartered in Paris. And we're lucky to have Cargill as an investor, one of America's greatest and largest private companies. But ultimately, you've got to be able to raise and leverage debt to deploy technology. And over a period of 20 years, you literally, for any single technology, this is going to run into billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for highlighting the need for investment. This one is for Arni, and you had mentioned this earlier. The oceans still represent poorly managed real estate. Why are we not actively managing ocean space to produce the future needs to a growing population?
Well, that's a very good question. But to start, it's not all poorly managed. There are very well-managed EEZs around the world, and we have seen improvements in certain areas. But unfortunately, a part of the improvement has been to reduce the effort and export the efforts to other areas, which then become poorly managed. The reason are probably is governance and it's finance, and we really need to find a way to get resources to the areas where we need to improve the management and support the governments that are sometimes in developing countries that need support. And we need to look to the parts of the world where the actual end product is consumed to contribute to that to a greater extent. It's very revealing, I meant to say, to look at a map which traces the trade lines of fish, where from and where to fish is traded. And we need to get some resources following back on these trade routes to improve the management.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for highlighting the importance of ocean management. Mindful of the time, we have one question that is a great final question for each of the panelists. Where do the panelists see the biggest opportunities ahead in their respective fields? Given that we have only about 4 minutes left, I would just like to ask you to just take 1 minute to answer this question. Where do you see the biggest opportunities ahead? So I would like to start with Anne, please.
Yeah, that is just aquaculture and improved techniques. I think there is such a big potential for this industry. And it is so important. I mean, in a global perspective.
Great, thanks for highlighting that. Ellen, I can imagine you agree to that, but where do you see the biggest opportunity in your opinion?
There is an acute need for alternate sources of protein. It really is quite serious. So deployment of world-scale plant. I'm not talking about someone producing 10 grams in a lab. There's a lot of innovative companies out there, and good luck to them. It takes a long time to get a product to market, but this market needs world-scale deployment of novel feed ingredients, so people know you can be trusted. They know you're going to be there not just today but tomorrow, and people will then start thinking about integrating novel solutions into the existing supply chain. But that scale is very difficult and expensive, and there's very few companies at the moment at the point we're at, and I encourage we look forward to more people being able to get to scale quickly. The aquaculture needs it desperately.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks a lot, Alan. And Arni, where do you see the biggest opportunities ahead?
Well, if you look again from the point of view of feeding the world, I think everybody agrees that capture fisheries have sort of reached a plateau. So there's not much to gain there from that perspective. But that doesn't mean that we can't increase the value of what we catch already and use the catch for different purposes. And that's where technological development comes in. And yes, in this day and age, we're looking for virucidal compounds. Definitely there's a possibility in the oceans. And we also have the problem of AMR, or antimicrobial resistance. And there are possibilities in the oceans to find solutions to that. So to feed the world, we need more fish, and that fish has to come from aquaculture. And I think we should try and support some of these blue communities in developing aquaculture to both feed themselves and their neighbors, and to export to other countries, to have foreign currencies that support them, development in general, and how we bridge the Great Divide.
Thanks a lot, Arni. And we have run out of time. Thanks for keeping your final answer short. So I'd like to thank again our great panelists, Ann Vistenthal, Arni Mathisen, and Alan Shaw for participating in this panel discussion. And it's been great to talk to you about the future of seafood and the challenges, but also opportunities that we face. And also thank you very much to the audience for sending in your questions. We have recorded all of them, and we're going to write an article based on this webinar, and we're also going to share the video of the webinar with you. So thanks again for participating. The next, as I mentioned, will on need for investment in ocean protection, and will take place on World Oceans Day on June the 8th. This will be by a webinar on tackling marine plastic pollution on June the 10th. All the details are on the screen. You can also already register for the World Ocean Summit and Expo 2021 in Lisbon, Portugal. And as I mentioned before, if you're interested in sponsoring some of the webinars that are upcoming, you have an opportunity. Please get in touch with my colleague Tatiana on the screen. Thanks a lot, everyone, again, and I hope to see you again soon at our next webinar.